The library of Greenbriar Manor had become a mausoleum of cold intentions and failed arithmetic. Adeline Vane sat at the massive mahogany desk that had once belonged to her father. A piece of furniture so grand it seemed to mock the dwindling candle that flickered in the draught. Her fingers, stained with the stubborn indigo of cheap ink, were white at the knuckles. Every few minutes she paused to blow upon them, watching the condensation of her own breath vanish into the shadows. Like a ghost, the house was holding its breath, a vast, drafty organism that seemed to sense the approaching end of its long, ancestral life. Before her lay the Vane ledger. It was a thick mahogany-bound ledger that smelled of old dust and the copper tang of fear. To Adeline, a ledger was the one honest room in the world. It did not offer the false comfort of social graces or the empty promises of distant cousins. It spoke only in the cold, unyielding language of numbers. She traced a column of figures with a trembling nib, her mind performing the scrupulous work of a liquidator. The truth was written in black and red. The estate was insolvent. The tenant rents had failed with the early frost. The roof of the home farm had collapsed under the weight of November rain, and the interest owed to Lord Julian Halloway was a shadow that grew longer with every tick of the clock. It was a quiet sort of violence, this slow descent into ruin. There were no marauding armies at the gates of Greenbriar, only the silent, persistent creep of damp rot, and the arrival of polite, terrifying letters sealed in black wax. Adeline felt the weight of her lineage as a physical burden, a stone pressed against her chest. She was the last of the Vanes, the daughter of a man whose heart had been as expansive as his pockets had been shallow. Thomas Vane had believed in the inherent goodness of the soil and the loyalty of his neighbors, but the soil had frozen and the neighbors had their own hungers to feed. She reached for the inkwell, only to find the liquid had begun to thicken in the freezing air. It was a small petty indignity that nearly broke her composure. Adeline did not weep. She had decided that tears were a currency she could no longer afford to spend, but she allowed her head to bow for a single, heavy moment. The silence of the library was not empty. It was heavy with the weight of portraits watching from the walls. Ancestors who had lived through wars and plagues, only to have their sanctuary sold to a man like Julian Halloway. She adjusted her woolen shawl, which was thin and offered little protection against the rising damp of Somerset, and forced her eyes back to the page. Then, the silence, it seemed, had teeth. A sound cut through the rhythmic scratching of her quill, a sharp, clear knock at the heavy oak front door. It was not the aggressive pounding of a creditor, nor the hesitant tap of a servant. It was a measured, deliberate sound that echoed through the hollowed-out grandeur of the hallway. Adeline froze. She looked at the clock. It was far too late for a social call, and far too early for the bailiffs. She rose from the desk, her movements stiff from hours of motionless study, and took up the lone candlestick. The walk from the library to the foyer felt like a journey through a dying kingdom. The floorboards groaned under her feet, an ancient language of wood and iron that spoke of neglect. When she reached the door, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the heavy brass bolt. She adjusted her posture, pulling her spine into the rigid line of propriety that her father had always admired. If this was the end, she would meet it with the dignity of a Vane, not the trembling of a victim. She pulled back the bolt and swung the door open. The night air rushed in, smelling of wet slate and the sharp, metallic promise of snow. Standing on the threshold was a man who seemed to have been carved from the very weather he arrived in. He was tall, his frame draped in a travel-worn cloak of heavy charcoal wool that had seen better years. A hat was pulled low over his brow, but Adeline could see the glint of winter-colored eyes, a cool, steady grey that did not blink. He was a sorrow wearing a man's coat, standing there in the gloom of the portico. He did not speak immediately. Instead, his gaze travelled past her into the darkened house, as if he were reading the history of the place in the peeling wallpaper and the scent of tallow. "I am looking for the daughter of Thomas Vane," the man said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that carried no hint of the frantic energy of the modern world. It was a voice of measurement and containment. "I am Adeline Vane," she replied, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "To whom do I owe the honor of this late hour?" The man stepped forward, just enough for the candlelight to catch the sharp angles of his face. He was not young, though the lines around his eyes spoke of experience rather than age. He looked like a scholar who had spent too much time in the sun, or a soldier who had spent too many years in a library. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair silvered at the temples. "My name is Silas Thorne," he said. "I was an old friend of your father, a scholarly companion from his younger days in London. I heard of his passing quite late, and I have travelled some distance to offer my condolences. He owed me nothing, but I owe him a debt of friendship that I intend to settle by offering what assistance I can in these difficult months." Adeline felt a flicker of skepticism. Her father had possessed many friends, most of whom had vanished the moment the wine cellar ran dry. This Silas Thorne looked as though he possessed little more than the clothes on his back and the sturdy boots on his feet. He did not appear to be a savior. He resembled a traveler who had walked through a storm and expected nothing but a place to stand. "I am afraid the house is in no condition to receive guests, mister." He did not offer money. He did not offer a marriage proposal or a legal maneuver. He offered to fix a door. It was an absurdity so profound that Adeline found herself stepping back, allowing him to enter. She watched as he stepped into the foyer, his presence immediately filling the empty space with a quiet, grounded authority. He was just a man, a friend of her father, yet as he closed the door behind him, the house seemed to sigh, as if it had been waiting 7 years for someone to notice its broken bones. Silas gestured toward the flickering light of the library, his silent invitation acknowledging that the work of a household began not at the door, but at its heart. The library at Greenbriar Manor was a room that had long since forgotten the warmth of a consistent fire. It was a space of reaching shadows and the scent of damp parchment. A mausoleum where the legacy of the Vane family lay bound in leather and gathering dust. Adeline Vane sat at the center of this gloom, her spine a rigid line of defiance against the encroaching cold. Her darkened digits moved with scrupulous precision across the yellowed pages of the Vane ledger, the scratch of her quill the only sound in the suffocating stillness as Silas Thorne moved through the room. Yet he claimed to be a mere academic friend of her late father. There was a stillness in him that did not belong to the lecture halls of Oxford. "You speak of my father, as if you shared more than just a correspondence over rare manuscripts, Mr. Thorne," Adeline said, her voice cutting through the silence with the sharp edge of a ledger's margin. She did not look up, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Thomas Vane was a man of profound silences. He did not open his door to many, and certainly not to those who travel without a visible means of support. Silas turned, his grey eyes catching the flickering light of the single tallow candle. They were the color of a winter sky, cool, observant, and impossible to read. "A man's wealth is not always found in his stable, Miss Vane. Your father and I shared a common language, not just of books, but of the things that remain when the books are closed." He moved toward the tea tray where the silver service sat, tarnished. Adeline watched as his fingers began to move with a strange, practiced grace. He picked up a linen napkin, his expression distant and melancholic. "When your father was troubled, when the weight of this house felt like a physical burden." "He had a peculiar habit," Silas murmured, his voice as soft as the falling snow. "He would take a napkin, precisely like this one, and fold the corners into 3 sharp, identical triangles. He believed that if he could impose order on a single scrap of fabric, he might eventually find a way to balance the accounts of his life." Adeline felt a sudden, sharp coldness in her chest. It was a detail so minute, so utterly private, that it felt like a ghost had reached out to touch her hand. She remembered those linen triangles on the dinner table, the silent evidence of her father's internal storms. No casual acquaintance could have known of that ritual. "He hummed too," she whispered, her skepticism beginning to crumble. "It was never a tune I recognized." "Low and tuneless," Silas added, a ghost of a smile haunting the corners of his mouth, like a bumblebee trapped in a jar. "He only did it when he was reading the Greeks." "He was a man of integrity in a world of artifice, Adeline. That is why I am here, not as a creditor, but as a witness." The house seemed to hold its breath as they looked at one another. The daughter who had inherited a ruin, and the stranger who held the keys to a past she had never fully understood. But the peace was shattered by a scent. It arrived before the man did, a cloying wave of expensive sandalwood and musk that felt like an assault. It spoke of London ballrooms and calculated vanity, having no place in the honest earthy air of Greenbriar. Lord Julian Halloway did not knock. He entered the library with the arrogant stride of one who believed the world was merely an extension of his own drawing room. His silk waistcoat was a garish crimson, and his boots were polished to a mirror shine that mocked the scuffed floorboards. "Still buried in those wretched books, Adeline?" Julian said, his voice a sharp breaking glass sound. He leaned against the mahogany desk, his gloved hand resting dangerously close to the Vane ledger. "Arithmetic is a tedious pursuit for a woman of your standing. It cannot save a sinking ship." His eyes then swept to the hearth, where Silas was stoking the fire. Julian's lip curled into a sneer of pure aristocratic condescension. "And what is this? A new gardener? Or perhaps a charity case you have plucked from the village green? This one looks as though he has not seen a decent meal since the turn of the century." Adeline stood, her smudged fingertips curling into fists. "Mr. Thorne is a friend of my father's, Lord Julian. He is a man of learning and character, qualities that are evidently in short supply in certain London circles." Julian let out a sharp bark of laughter. He circled Silas with predatory confidence. "A scholar, he looks more like a pauper with pretensions. Look at those boots. They have seen more mud than a common plough. Tell me, fellow, does your scholarship include knowing when to bow to your betters?" Silas did not look up. He continued to watch the embers, the heavy iron poker held loosely in his hand, yet the air grew thick, charged with an invisible tension. Adeline noticed the way Silas's knuckles had turned white against the iron, his grey eyes fixed with a terrifying, predatory stillness upon the pulse at Julian's throat. "He is my guest," Adeline interjected, her voice cold and iron-hard, "and your presence here is as uninvited as it is unwelcome. If you have come to discuss the debt, do so through legal channels, not by insulting those within my home." Julian ignored her, leaning down to whisper into Silas's ear. "I will not have a beggar haunting these halls when I take possession. You would do well to find a hedge to sleep under before the week is out." Silas finally turned his head. He did not flinch. He simply looked at the aristocrat, a long, measuring gaze that seemed to strip away the silk to the hollow man beneath. The ensuing quiet was barbed and unforgiving. Julian took a half-step back, his sneer faltering as he encountered a coldness he could not comprehend. "Mute, as well?" Julian spat, turning on his heel to hide his unease. "The bailiffs will be less silent when they arrive. Adeline, this house is a corpse, and I am merely here to collect the shroud." As the heavy oak door slammed shut, the house held its breath once more. Adeline sank back into her chair, her strength spent. She looked at Silas, who was once again a shadow by the hearth, wondering what kind of man could face such venom with the calm of a winter stone. The ledger remained open between them, an honest, unforgiving record of a world falling apart, while the man who folded napkins like her father watched the fire with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. The morning air in Somerset was the color of a faded bruise, heavy with the scent of wet slate and the pervasive underlying damp of a house that had long since forgotten the touch of warmth. At the far edge of the neglected kitchen garden, where the ancient dry stone wall had surrendered to the persistent intrusion of ivy and time, the silence was broken only by a methodical, rhythmic sound, the dry, hollow clack of granite meeting granite. Adeline Vane stood by the library window, her ink-stained fingers resting against the cold glass. She watched as Silas Thorne worked, his tall frame bent over the ruins of the boundary. He did not labor with the frantic, clumsy haste of a hired hand, nor did he possess the weary, rounded shoulders of the village laborers who had occasionally come to mend the estate's many fractures. Instead, he moved with a scrupulous, almost architectural precision. He would lift a stone, turning it in his large, calloused hands as if interrogating its weight and its history, before settling it into the gap with a finality that suggested it would never move again. It was a strange sight, a man who claimed to be a mere scholarly friend of her late father, Thomas Vane, spending his second month of residence performing the back-breaking labor of a mason. Adeline felt a flicker of something she had not permitted herself to experience in years: curiosity. Her father had spoken of Silas as a man of letters, a quiet academic with whom he had shared a brief but intense correspondence during his travels. Yet, as she watched the flecks of Silas's back beneath his travel-worn linen shirt, she saw a physical competence that contradicted the image of a man confined to a study. He was rebuilding the walls stone by stone, restoring the bones of Greenbriar Manor, while the house itself seemed to hold its breath, as if surprised by the sudden care. The sound reached her then, drifting on the chill wind that rattled the casement. Silas was humming. It was a low, resonant melody that possessed a peculiar, haunting cadence. Adeline felt her spine stiffen as the notes took shape in her mind. It was not a peasant's ditty or a tavern chorus. It was the intricate polyphonic structure of an ancient courtly hymn, a piece of music usually reserved for the high liturgy of the royal chapel or the gilded halls of the capital. She found herself opening the window a fraction, the wood groaning in protest, to hear more clearly the sophisticated grace of the tune. Later, when the sun had failed to pierce the grey canopy and Silas had retreated to the porch to clean his tools, Adeline approached him. She carried a tray with a single mug of cider, her own hand still bearing the faint, dark ghosts of the Vane ledger, the black ink that marked her daily struggle to keep their debts from drowning them. Silas looked up as she neared, his grey eyes the cool, unreadable color of the very stones he had been stacking. He did not smile, but the tension in his jaw seemed to ease by the smallest of margins. Adeline set the mug down on the weathered bench beside him. She noted the abrasions on his knuckles, the skin torn by the rough granite, yet his fingers remained steady as he reached for the drink. "You have a remarkable talent for masonry, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice even and poised, "and an even more remarkable memory for music. That hymn you were humming, it is quite a complex choice for a garden task." Silas paused, the mug halfway to his lips. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, where the mist was beginning to swallow the lower meadows. "It is merely a folk song, Miss Vane," he replied, his tone as level as her own. "A melody from a small village I once visited in the north. The rhythm helps the work. It is nothing more than a ghost of a memory." Adeline did not press him, though the lie sat between them, like an unpolished stone. She knew the difference between a village song and a royal anthem, just as she knew that a simple academic did not usually possess the calloused hands of a soldier or the silent, watchful dignity of a man used to being obeyed. Silas Thorne remained a riddle she could not yet solve, a tragic figure in human form, standing guard over a ruin that was not his own. The following afternoon, the fragile stillness of the estate was interrupted by the rattling of a small pony-drawn cart and the shrill, familiar voice of Bessie Miller. The neighbor arrived not with the usual pleasantries, but with a basket of eggs and a face pinched with the specific sharp-edged concern of a village gossip who had caught the scent of a scandal. Adeline met her at the kitchen door, the smell of fresh straw and damp earth following the older woman inside. Bessie did not wait to be invited. She set the basket on the scrubbed pine table and leaned in, her eyes darting toward the window where Silas could be seen hauling another load of stone. "You must be careful, Adeline," the woman whispered, her voice a hurried rasp. "The village is talking. They have seen him at the tavern when he goes for supplies, and they have seen him on the road. They say he is not what he seems. Some say he is a runaway from the army, or perhaps a spy sent by the neighboring lords to see just how weak the Vane holdings have become." Adeline felt a cold prickle of indignation. "Mr. Thorne is a friend of my father's, Bessie. He is here to assist me with the transition of the estate. He is doing the work that no one else in this parish would deign to touch for the pittance I can offer. He is a scholar, nothing more." Bessie crossed herself, a gesture that seemed oddly dramatic in the mundane light of the kitchen. "A scholar?" she scoffed, her gaze returning to the man in the garden. "Look at the way he moves, child. He walks too quietly for a man with a clean conscience. He passes through the village like a shadow, and the hounds, even the meanest of them, they do not bark at him. They simply sit and watch him pass, as if they recognize something in him that we do not. There is a weight to him, Adeline, a weight that does not belong to a pauper or a teacher." Adeline looked out the window. Silas was standing perfectly still, his hand resting on the new section of the wall. He was watching the woods, his profile sharp and unyielding against the darkening sky. She thought of the way he had looked at her the previous evening, not as a master looks at a servant, nor as a man looks at a woman, but as an equal looks at a partner in a difficult endeavor. "I do not believe he is a spy," Adeline said, though her heart had begun a slow, rhythmic thumping against her ribs. "He has done nothing but work. He has asked for no payment, and he has offered only his labor." "That is the danger of it," Bessie replied, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Men do not give labor for nothing in this world. Everything is a ledger. Adeline, everything has a price. If he is not taking your coin, then he is taking something else. You are alone in this great empty house, and the wolves are already at the door. Do not invite a lion inside and call it a pet. As Bessie Miller departed, the cart disappearing into the gloom of the driveway, Adeline remained in the kitchen. The house felt larger than it had a moment before, the shadows in the corners deeper and more accusatory. She looked at her own hands, the inkstains a testament to her struggle to remain solvent. And then she looked back at the wall. Silas Thorne was still there, a silhouette of quiet, iron-hard authority. He was a nobody, a simple friend of her father, yet the quiet around him felt distinctly predatory, waiting for the moment the truth would finally be forced into the light. The morning arrived not with the sun, but with a low, bruised sky that seemed to press the very breath out of the valley. Adeline Vane stood upon the porch of Greenbriar Manor, her hands tucked deep into the pockets of a wool pelisse that had seen better decades. Below, in the yard, the mud was a thick, sucking soup, and within it stood a man who smelled of damp wool and old greed. He was a bailiff's man, a collector sent by the invisible machinery of the law to claim the only living assets the estate had left, the 3 milk cows that provided the village children with their only reliable sustenance. Adeline felt the familiar, cold constriction in her chest, a physical weight that sat where her hope used to live. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the rough edge of the Vane ledger, that mahogany-bound book which remained the only honest room in a world built on gilded lies. The man, a brutish sort with a face like curdled cream, did not look at her as a lady. He looked at her as a debt that required settling. He barked a command to his assistants, gesturing toward the low stone wall of the barn. Adeline stepped forward, her voice thin but sharp as a needle. She told him that the animals were not part of the primary lien, that they were reserved for the maintenance of the tenants. The man merely laughed, a sound like gravel, turning in a tin bucket, and produced a crumpled sheet of parchment. He informed her that the law did not care for the bellies of tenants. It cared for the pockets of Lord Julian Halloway. It was then that Silas Thorne emerged from the shadows of the stable, his winter-colored eyes fixed upon the collector. He did not carry a pitchfork or a heavy stick. He carried nothing but a small, ink-stained voucher and a quietness that made the air around him feel suddenly brittle. He walked through the mud with a deliberate grace that seemed constitutionally at odds with his rugged gardening clothes. The collector sneered, dismissing the man he believed to be a mere academic stray, a shadow of Adeline's late father. He told Silas to move aside before he was trampled by the very beasts he sought to protect. Silas did not move. He reached out and took the crumpled parchment from the collector's hand with a speed that suggested a hawk taking a field mouse. He did not shout. Instead, he spoke in a voice that was level, cultured, and terrifyingly precise. He informed the man that he was in violation of the 3rd easement of the Somerset Charter of 1482. The collector scoffed, demanding to know what a common labourer knew of charters and ancient law. Adeline watched, her heart hammering against her ribs, as Silas opened the Vane ledger, which he had taken from the library earlier that morning. He pointed to a single line of script, old and faded, where a minute mark of ink, a comma, sat between 2 legal terms. Silas explained that because of that specific comma, the livestock were legally bound to the land's easement and could not be severed from the estate so long as a single Vane descendant remained in residence. The collector stared at the book, his brow furrowing as he tried to decipher the elegant, archaic Latin. Silas translated it for him, his tone becoming increasingly cold, increasingly aristocratic. He pointed out that if the cows were moved, the collector would be liable for a felony under the king's own decree regarding agricultural stability. The man looked from the book to Silas's face, and for the first time he saw something that made him step back. He did not see a scholar. He saw someone who understood the architecture of power better than the men who signed his paychecks. With a muttered curse and a look of genuine confusion, the collector signaled his men to retreat, leaving the yard as quickly as the mud would allow. The stillness that followed felt dangerous. Adeline looked at Silas, her mind racing to reconcile the man who chopped wood with the individual who had just dismantled a legal threat with a grammatical technicality. She asked him how he had known where to look, how he had seen a loophole that 3 different solicitors had missed. Silas merely closed the ledger, his expression returning to that of the weary, quiet friend of her father. He said that when one has spent 7 years in the company of ghosts and old books, one learns that the truth is often hidden in the smallest pauses. He handed the book back to her, but he did not meet her eyes, and the distance between them felt suddenly like a vast, uncrossable sea. An hour later, the arrival of a supply cart broke the heavy stillness of the afternoon. A merchant from the village had brought a shipment of coal and salt, items Adeline had barely managed to afford by selling her last silver hairbrushes. The merchant was a nervous man, eager to be away from a house that felt as though it were holding its breath. He presented a delivery receipt, and Silas, who had been clearing the dead vines from the porch, stepped forward to sign it on Adeline's behalf. The sun chose that moment to pierce through the grey veil of the clouds, casting a sharp, unforgiving light across the porch. As Silas reached for the merchant's quill, his heavy leather gardening glove slipped slightly, revealing the back of his hand. Adeline, standing just a few feet away, froze. Glinting against his tanned, calloused skin was a ring. It was not the gold and sapphire vanity of a London dandy, nor was it the polished signet of a local squire. It was a band of rusted black iron, heavy and ancient, bearing a crest that seemed to suck the very light out of the room. She saw a glimpse of a broken tower and a crown of thorns etched into the dark metal, a symbol so old it predated the current dynasty. It was the Iron Seal, a thing spoken of in hushed tones in histories of the northern borders, belonging to a house that had once served as the shield of the kingdom, before vanishing into the mists of grief and war. Silas Adeline felt a coldness settle in her bones that had nothing to do with the Somerset wind. She realized then that the gentleman claiming to be a simple academic, a humble friend of her father, carried a weight of history that made her own troubles seem like dust. She looked at his grey eyes, which were now as hard and unreadable as the iron on his finger. She wanted to ask him what a man with such a seal was doing in a crumbling manor in the middle of nowhere, why he was scrubbing floors and auditing ledgers, when he clearly possessed the authority to move mountains. But the look on his face stopped the words in her throat. He was a spectre of grief, and she understood that the danger she faced from Lord Julian was nothing compared to the secrets hidden in the heart of Silas Thorne. She went to bed that night with the Iron Seal burned into her memory, unaware that by dawn, the threat to her home would turn from legal papers to the very earth itself. The morning did not arrive with the usual chorus of the Somerset birds, but with a silence so profound it felt as though Greenbriar Manor had finally ceased its laboured breathing. Adeline Vane stood in the kitchen garden, her breath blooming in white plumes against the biting frost of the October air. She had reached for the iron handle of the pump, expecting the familiar, rhythmic groan of the mechanism and the gush of clear spring water, but the machine resisted her. When it finally yielded, the liquid that spilled into her wooden bucket was not the lifeblood of the estate, but a turgid, yellowish sludge that carried an odor so sharp it stung the back of her throat. It was the smell of a chemical rot. The smell of Julian Halloway's reach, as staring at the bucket when a shadow lengthened across the frost, and Silas Thorne appeared at her side. He did not ask what was wrong. He merely looked at the fouled water with eyes the color of a winter sky that had seen too many storms. Silas knelt by the pump, his movements possessing a grace that his rough wool coat and mud-caked boots could not entirely conceal. He dipped a single finger into the sludge and brought it to his nose, his brow furrowed in a scrupulous concentration that seemed far too clinical for a simple scholar. He did not taste it, thank God, but his lips thinned into a hard, dangerous line. He spoke in a voice that was low and vibrated with a sudden suppressed authority. "It is not natural decay, Adeline. This is hellebore and concentrated lye, a mixture designed to sit in the silt and poison the vein for months. It was a calculated act of malice, one that required more than a common labourer's knowledge of the land." Adeline felt the simmering indignation rise within her, her tinted fingers clenching into fists at her sides. "Julian Halloway," she whispered, the name tasting like ash. "He would see us parched and broken before he allows the winter to pass." Silas stood, brushing the dirt from his knees with a rhythmic, measured motion. He did not look defeated. He appeared as a general surveying a map. "There is a secondary source," he said, his voice carrying a strange, resonant certainty. Your father once spoke of a hidden cistern, built during the unrest of the last century. It was designed to be independent of the main well, a secret reserve for a house under threat. How could you know of such a thing? Adeline asked, her skepticism battling her desperation. My father never mentioned it to me. Silas did not answer immediately. He led her toward the cellar steps, his steps sure despite the gloom. He moved to a specific section of the foundation, where the stones were laid in a pattern that seemed haphazard to the untrained eye, but held a geometric precision to those who understood the language of architecture. He pressed his calloused palm against a cold, damp slab and heaved. The stone did not merely shift, it groaned as if a long dormant heart were beginning to beat again. Behind it lay a dry, hollow space containing a leather-bound roll of vellum, a complex irrigation map of Greenbriar that Adeline had never seen in all her years of auditing the estate's archives. Silas unrolled the map on a nearby crate, his fingers tracing the lines with a familiarity that chilled her. Here, he said, pointing to a vein of blue ink that ran deep beneath the manor's bones. The cistern is fed by a limestone spring 300 yards to the north. It is blocked, not poisoned. If we can clear the intake, the house will breathe again. He looked at her then, and for a fleeting second, the scholar was gone. In his place stood a man who looked as though he had commanded legions, his grey eyes burning with an intellectual spark that made the cold cellar feel suddenly, inexplicably warm. Later that evening, the library was a mausoleum of shadows, lit only by the flickering orange glow of a dying fire. Adeline sat at the heavy mahogany desk, the Vane ledger open before her. The numbers were a battlefield, a record of debts and dwindling resources that she fought to master every night. Silas was across the room, ostensibly mending a broken chair, but his gaze was fixed on the window, watching the moonlight wash over the Somerset hills. The house was holding its breath, the silence between them thick with the unsaid truths of the morning's discovery. I find myself wondering, Mr. Thorne, Adeline said, not looking up from her accounts, how a man of your supposed station knows the precise smell of hellebore and the architectural secrets of a house he has only just entered. Silas turned slowly, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face. He looked weary, an embodiment of profound mourning. One learns many things when the world is on fire, Adeline. In the war, we saw more than just the movement of troops. We saw the way men use the earth itself as a weapon. Power is a fragile thing, often held by those who do not deserve the weight of it. He walked toward the desk, his presence filling the room with the scent of bergamot and old leather. He looked down at the ledger, his eyes scanning her scrupulous columns of figures. Julian Halloway thinks he is a king in this small corner of the world, Silas continued, his voice dropping an octave. He believes that rank is a shield for cruelty, but George was always of the opinion that true authority must be earned through the protection of the weak, not their exploitation. He is a man of grand gestures, but he lacks the patience for the quiet work of restoration. Adeline froze, her pen hovering over the page, leaving a dark, growing blot of ink on the parchment. George, she repeated, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. You speak of His Majesty as though he were a troublesome cousin you once shared a carriage with. Silas stiffened, a flicker of something. Perhaps regret, perhaps old habit, crossing his features. He quickly looked away, his jaw tightening as he corrected himself with a stately, practiced ease. I meant, of course, the king, Miss Vane. My father's letters often spoke of him with a certain familiarity. It was a slip of the tongue, nothing more. He turned back to the fire, but the air in the room had shifted. The deception, thin as it was, felt as though it were beginning to fray at the edges. Adeline looked at the back of the man she had taken for a simple academic friend, noting the way he carried his shoulders, stiff, unyielding, like a soldier standing guard over a grave. She realized then that being seen by the right person was not the danger she had once feared. It was the only safety worth the name in a world that sought to drown her in shadows. Silas Thorne was a mystery she could not yet solve, but as the fire crackled and the house settled into a deeper, warmer quiet, she knew that the ledger of his life held far more than he was willing to confess. For the first time in 7 years, the cold stone of Greenbriar did not feel like a prison but a fortress, and the man standing in its center was its true silent architect. The great kitchen of Greenbriar Manor did not welcome the assembly, it merely endured them. The air was thick with the scent of damp wool, wood smoke, and the low, thrumming vibration of collective anxiety that always preceded a disaster. Adeline Vane stood by the heavy oak table, her ink-stained fingers resting atop the Vane ledger, as if the weight of the book could anchor her against the storm. Before her sat 20 men and women, the backbone of the estate, whose faces were etched with the arithmetic of survival. They had heard the rumors of the black wax seals and the cold ambitions of Lord Julian Halloway, and they had come seeking a salvation. Adeline was not certain she possessed the currency to provide. The hushed room possessed a biting tension, gnawing at the resolve of the tenants until old Miller stood, his cap crushed between gnarled hands. He spoke of the winter stores, of the leaky thatch in the northern cottages, and of the fear that a new master would not care for the soil or the souls that tended it. Adeline opened her mouth to offer a platitude of hope, but the words felt like counterfeit coin in her throat. She was a woman of ledgers and logic, and the logic of their situation was increasingly insolvent. It was then that Silas Thorne moved. He had been leaning against the shadows of the hearth, a silent monument to loss. But as he stepped into the flickering circle of tallow candlelight, the room seemed to contract around his presence. He did not possess a title, yet the way he held his shoulders suggested a man who had long ago mastered the architecture of command. He did not speak to them as a landlord or a superior, but as a witness to their history. He began to speak, not of debts or yields, but of names. He spoke to Bessie Miller of her grandfather's tenacity during the Great Flood of '98, recalling how the man had saved the bridge with nothing but rope and a stubborn refusal to let the river win. He turned to the young shepherd, Arthur, and remarked on the specific lineage of his flock, tracing then the bloodlines back through 3 generations of Vane stewardship with a precision that left the room breathless. Silas Thorne was weaving a tapestry of belonging, a link of history that the gold of Julian Halloway could never hope to purchase. Adeline watched him, her heart performing a strange, rhythmic stutter. Silas was managing their fears with a scrupulous empathy, providing a social engineering that was far more potent than any legal decree. He reminded them that a house is not merely stone and timber, but the memory of those who breathe within its walls. By the time he finished, the jagged edges of their panic had been smoothed into a quiet, iron-hard loyalty. Bessie Miller looked at the man Adeline had introduced as a mere scholar, and for the first time in months, the woman's eyes did not reflect the coming winter. They reflected a belief in a future they had nearly surrendered. When the tenants finally departed, leaving the kitchen to the cooling embers and the settling dust, the house seemed to exhale a long-held breath. Adeline turned to Silas, her mind whirring with questions she did not yet have the courage to articulate. He looked at her, his frosty eyes softening just enough to be dangerous. He had saved the peace of the evening, but the mystery of his competence remained, a ledger that refused to balance regardless of how many times she checked the entries. Later that night, the library remained a mausoleum of silenced intentions, the cold Somerset air seeping through the stone window frames. Adeline sat at her father's mahogany desk, her fingers tracing the scars and ink stains of a man who had died, leaving behind more secrets than gold. She was looking for a ghost, a deed, a letter, any fragment of propriety that could halt the eviction notice she knew Julian was preparing. Silas sat across from her, his large, calloused hands resting idly on his knees, yet he was more observant than any man she had ever known. Perhaps it was the way the moonlight hit the grain of the wood, or perhaps it was the sheer desperation of her search. But Adeline's thumb caught on a small, nearly invisible protrusion beneath the desk's lip. With a sharp click that sounded like a pistol hammer in the stillness, a narrow compartment slid forward. Inside lay a single piece of parchment, yellowed by time, and utterly blank. Adeline pulled it out, her brow furrowed in frustration as she turned the empty vellum over in the candlelight. "It is nothing," she whispered, the weight of her disappointment feeling like granite in her chest. Silas Thorne rose from his chair, his movements fluid and intentional. He walked to her side, his scent, a subtle blend of bergamot and old leather, reaching her before he spoke. He did not ask for permission, he simply reached out and placed his hand over hers on the parchment. The reaction was instantaneous and profound, as if the heat from his palm were a catalyst for some forgotten alchemy. The blank surface began to stir. Adeline gasped as ink began to bloom across the page like a dark, creeping flower, the letters forming with a meticulous, rhythmic grace. It was not a magic of old tales, but a sophisticated trick of chemistry and heat, a secret intended only for a specific touch. The script was her father's, but the words were a revelation. It spoke of a debt of honor, of a protector who would arrive when the shadows grew longest, and of a name that was never to be spoken aloud until the king himself demanded it. Adeline looked from the blooming text to the man standing beside her. Silas did not pull his hand away, and, for a moment, the intellectual parity between them was eclipsed by a raw, terrifying vulnerability. "In 7 years, you are the first person who has looked at me and not seen a grave," Silas murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to resonate in the very marrow of her bones. He was no longer just her father's friend, the scholarly academic, who chopped wood and audited tenant ledgers. He was a man who carried a fire beneath the ice of his grief, a man whose very touch could force the truth from the silence. Adeline realized then that the danger was not in the secret Silas Thorne kept, but in the terrifying possibility that she was the only one who could truly see the man behind the mask. The manor had ceased its anxious pause. It was waiting for her to decide if she was brave enough to exhale. The gravel of the drive did not merely crunch under the weight of the carriage. It groaned, a sound like teeth grinding in a feverish sleep. Adeline Vane stood upon the porch, the Vane ledger clutched to her chest, as if the mahogany-bound book could serve as a breastplate against the coming storm. The air in Somerset had turned brittle, the late afternoon light, the color of a tarnished shilling. Beside her, Silas Thorne stood with the stillness of a statue, his grey eyes fixed on the approaching vehicle, with a level of detachment that was, in itself, a form of violence. He did not move, he did not speak, but the very air around him seemed to thicken, a cold front moving in before the gale. The carriage door swung open before the vehicle had fully come to a halt, and Julian Halloway stepped out, the cloying, expensive scent of his bergamot and musk cologne reaching them before his boots touched the mud. He was followed by a man in a soot-colored coat, a royal bailiff whose presence felt like a smudge upon the landscape. Lord Julian did not offer a greeting. He did not remove his hat. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and produced a scroll of parchment that seemed to radiate a malevolent heat. "The time for counting copper and hiding behind ancient ledgers has ended, Adeline," Julian said, his voice a sharp blade wrapped in silk. He held out the document, and the light caught the heavy dark protrusion at its base, the black wax seal. It was the official mark of the crown, a finality that transcended local law and personal grievance. It declared the Vane lands forfeit, the lineage solvent no longer, and the house itself a ward of the state to be liquidated at his pleasure. Adeline reached out, her stained fingertips trembling as she took the parchment. The wax felt cold, like the skin of a reptile. At that moment, she realized she was still holding a single yellow wildflower she had plucked from the garden path, a small, resilient primrose. Seeing it, the lip of Julian Halloway curled in a sneer that was more a twitch of boredom than an expression of malice. He reached out, his gloved hand closing over her knuckles, and with a slow, deliberate pressure, he ground the flower into her palm until the petals were nothing more than a green and yellow smear. "A fitting end for a weed," he whispered, his eyes never leaving hers. "The bailiff will remain at the gate. You have until the sunrise to vacate. I shall return then to take possession of the keys." He turned his gaze to Silas, who remained as unmoving as a winter oak. "And you, schoolmaster, I suggest you find a library elsewhere to rot in. This house no longer has a use for parasites." As the carriage retreated, the resulting quiet was barbed. It gnawed at the edges of the resolve of Adeline, the weight of the dark crest feeling like a mountain in her hands. The house, she felt, was holding its breath, the very stones of the walls contracting in a final dying spasm of loyalty. "We must pack," Adeline said, her voice a ghost of itself. "The ledger, it does not matter now. Arithmetic cannot fight a seal of the king." She looked at her palm, at the crushed remains of the primrose, and felt the first true crack in her constitution. The arithmetic of her life had finally come to a sum of 0. "Instead," Silas said, his voice cutting through her despair with a clarity that was almost offensive, "we shall polish the silver." Adeline turned to him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Did you not hear him? "The bailiff is at the gate, Silas. We are evicted. By morning I shall be a beggar, and you will be a wanderer. What use is silver to a woman with no table to set it upon?" The man did not look at her. He walked past her into the great hall, his stride purposeful and devoid of the scholarly slouch he had worn for months. He stopped before the heavy mahogany dining table, which was covered in a thin veil of dust, and ran a calloused finger across its surface. "The king is coming to tea, Adeline. It would be a grave breach of propriety to serve him on tarnished plates." "The king?" she repeated, the words sounding like a madness. "George Augustus is in Bath, surrounded by his court and his vanities. He does not know Somerset exists, let alone this crumbling mausoleum he knows." Silas Thorne replied. He picked up a discarded rag from a side table and began to rub at a smudge on a high-backed chair. His posture had shifted. The man who had spent weeks gardening and auditing books now stood with a terrifying, iron-hard authority. He moved with a scrupulous efficiency, his back as straight as a soldier's pike, yet his hands performed the menial task with a strange, reverent care. "Polish the silver, Adeline," he commanded, and for the first time his voice did not sound like that of a friend of her father or a humble academic. It sounded like a decree. "The Vane family has held this land for 400 years. Do not let it fall while the house is in disarray. We shall prepare the great hall. We shall light the candles. We shall meet the dawn not as victims, but as hosts." There was a spark in his winter-colored eyes that she walked to the sideboard and opened the heavy drawer. The silver was black with neglect, the spoons and platters looking like relics from a sunken ship. She picked up a heavy tray, her ink-stained fingers finding the familiar weight of the metal. If they were to lose everything, if the ledger was finally closed and the debt was called in, she would at least face the creditor with her head held high and the silver bright enough to reflect his shame. She began to rub the metal, the rhythmic sound of the cloth against the silver filling the hollow silence of the house. Beside her, Silas continued to master the room, performing the work of a commander. When he eventually turned toward the subterranean depths of the manor, Adeline found her curiosity outweighing her fear, and she followed him down into the darkness. The armory of Greenbriar Manor was a room that had long forgotten the taste of light. It was a subterranean space, where the air was thick with the scent of ancient iron, cold stone, and the persistent, creeping damp of a Somerset winter. Adeline Vane descended the stone steps with a lamp in one hand, and her ledger clutched to her chest, seeking the man she still believed to be her father's simple, scholarly companion. She expected to find Silas Thorne cataloguing the rusted breastplates of her ancestors, or perhaps dusting the commemorative pikes from the era of the Great Rebellion. Instead, the sight that met her in the guttering amber light caused her to stop, her breath catching in the hollow of her throat. Silas was not merely inspecting the collection. He had transformed the center of the room into a site of scrupulous, silent labor. He was stripped of his heavy coat, his linen shirt sleeves rolled back to reveal forearms that were a map of corded muscle and old silvered scars. He sat upon a low wooden bench, a long, notch-scarred sword resting across his knees, the ornamental blade of a gentleman's wall. It was a heavy, utilitarian weapon of war, its steel dull and grey like a winter sky. With a focus that bordered on the devotional, Silas was drawing a whetstone along the edge of the metal. The sound was rhythmic, a metallic hiss that seemed to scrape against the very silence of the house. Adeline watched, fascinated and unsettled, as he worked. There was an economy to his movements that suggested a deep, cellular memory of the task. He appeared to be a man who spent his life in libraries. He seemed to be a man who knew the precise weight of a life at the end of a blade. Silas paused, raising the weapon to the light of a nearby torch. With a terrifyingly casual gesture, he pressed the pad of his thumb against the newly sharpened edge. A single, perfect bead of crimson blood bloomed upon his skin, a sphere of life against the cold death of the steel. He did not flinch. Instead, he simply wiped the blood away with a rag, his winter-colored eyes remaining as cool and unreadable as the stone walls around them. The realization sat heavy in her stomach, a leaden weight of arithmetic that did not sum. Her father had spoken of Silas as a man of letters, a quiet soul who preferred the company of books to the clamor of the world. Yet, the man before her handled the instrument of execution with the same ease that she handled a quill. He was a puzzle with pieces that belonged to different sets. a ledger where the credits and debits would not balance. When he finally looked up and saw her standing in the shadows, he did not startle. He simply laid the sword aside, the silence in the room suddenly possessing teeth that gnawed at her composure. He was the payment for a debt she did not understand, and the armor he wore was not made of steel, but of a calculated, impenetrable stillness. The peace of the armory was shattered not by a word, but by the distant rhythmic thud of hooves upon the frozen drive. The house, sensitive to the change in the atmosphere, seemed to hold its breath. Adeline felt the shift in her very marrow, a premonition of the storm that had been gathering since the day she buried her father. She hurried to the front hall, her marked hands trembling as she adjusted the heavy mahogany-bound Vane ledger against her side. It was her only shield, her only honest room in a world that was rapidly turning to glass. Through the tall, narrow windows of the porch, she saw them. Julian Halloway had returned, and he had not come alone. He rode at the head of a small, grim-faced militia, their horses' breath billowing in the freezing air like the smoke of a coming conflict. Julian himself was a vision of cloying, expensive vanity, his coat a shade of blue so vibrant it seemed an insult to the grey Somerset afternoon. Even from this distance, Adeline imagined she could smell his perfume, that scent of jasmine and arrogance that always heralded a fresh cruelty. He reined in his mount with a flourish, the dark stamp of the eviction notice visible in the hand of the bailiff who rode beside him. Adeline stepped out onto the porch, her spine as straight as a ledger line. She did not have an army. She did not have a title that carried weight in the halls of London. She had only the truth of the numbers and the cold stone of Greenbriar behind her. As the militia began to fan out, surrounding the house in a semicircle of iron and intent, she felt she held the Vane ledger out before her, pressing it against her heart as the bailiff began to dismount. The ominous emblem caught the fading light, a dark, accusing eye that demanded her surrender. The air was so cold it burned her lungs, yet she did not retreat. She stood her ground upon the porch of the house that had birthed her, a wallflower, who had finally decided to bloom in the frost. The silence between the two parties was a living thing, a tension that pulled taut until it threatened to snap. Julian began to speak, his voice a sharp breaking glass in the stillness, but Adeline was no longer listening to his threats. She was listening to the house, which was no longer frozen in suspense, but was instead exhaling a long, cold sigh of readiness, sensing the arrival of a conflict that would either mend its foundations or level them to the dust. The air outside Greenbriar Manor had turned into a thick, milky soup of Somerset mist, the kind of dampness that does not merely sit upon the skin, but seeps into the very marrow of one's bones. Adeline Vane stood by the narrow window of the morning room, her smudged fingers pressing against the cold glass until the heat of her pulse left a blurred ghost of a print upon the pane. Below, the gravel drive groaned as Julian Halloway completed his advance, flanked by the very local militia he had summoned to enforce the cruelty of the black wax seal. They were not here for a legal discussion. They were here to enact violence. But Silas Thorne was already there. He did not wait for them to reach the door. He had stepped out from the shadows of the carriage house, still wearing the heavy wool-lined coat that made him look more like a weary traveler than a man of consequence. He moved with a preternatural stillness, walking to the scent of the road that led to the manor's heart. He did not carry a weapon. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood, a solitary figure against a line of 6 mounted men, his grey eyes as cold and unforgiving as the winter sky above the Mendip Hills. Julian Halloway sat atop his bay gelding, the smell of his expensive, cloying cologne, somehow cutting through the scent of wet earth and horse sweat. He looked down at Silas with a sneer that twisted his handsome, vacant features. Julian gestured broadly toward the house, his voice carrying the sharp edge of unearned authority. He commanded the militia captain to clear the path, to remove the impoverished scholar who dared to obstruct the king's business. The militia captain, a man of middle years with a face like scarred leather, spurred his horse forward, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his saber. Silas did not flinch. He did not move an inch as the massive animal loomed over him, its hot breath blooming in the air like white smoke. The stillness carried a sharp, biting pressure that held the entire drive in a state of suffocating stasis. When the captain reached the point where his horse's chest nearly brushed Silas's shoulder, The scholar leaned forward. It was a movement so slight that Adeline almost missed it from her vantage point. He did not shout. He did not plead. Silas Thorne merely whispered a single word to the lead captain, a low, guttural sound that seemed to carry the weight of an iron vault closing. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The captain's horse, a beast trained for the chaos of a skirmish, reared back with a scream of pure animal terror, its hooves pawing at the mist as if trying to climb the very air to escape. The captain struggled to keep his seat, his face draining of all color, until he appeared as someone who had seen his own grave opened before him. He stared at Silas, not with the annoyance of a soldier dealing with a peasant, but with the wide-eyed, paralyzing shock of someone who had just recognized a ghost. Julian Halloway's voice broke the spell, high and shrill with indignation. He demanded to know why the men had stopped, why they allowed themselves to be bullied by a man who possessed nothing but a tattered coat and a collection of dusty books. He screamed of the eviction notice, of the black wax, and of the power of his own name. But the militia captain was no longer listening to the man who had hired him. He had regained control of his trembling mount, yet he made no move to advance. Instead, he looked at his men, his voice cracking as he issued a command that made Julian's jaw drop in speechless fury. The captain ordered his men to stand down. He cited a prior engagement of the utmost urgency, a sudden realization of a jurisdictional error that he could not, or would not, explain. Julian sputtered, his face turning a dark, bruised purple, but the soldiers were already turning their horses. They moved with a frantic, disciplined haste, as if the road to Greenbriar had suddenly turned into a bed of burning coals. Julian was left alone at the head of the drive, his bay gelding dancing nervously away from the quiet man who still occupied the center of the path. Before the captain turned to follow his men, he did something that caused the breath to catch in Adeline's throat. He did not look at Julian. He looked at Silas Thorne. In a quick, sharp movement, the captain brought his hand to his brow in a crisp, soldierly salute. A gesture of high-ranking acknowledgement that was never, under any circumstances, offered to a common scholar or a father's simple friend. It was a salute born of deep, ingrained muscle memory, the kind offered only to a man who had commanded legions. Silas did not return the gesture. He merely nodded, his posture remaining that of a deeply burdened soul. Julian Halloway let out a strangled cry of rage, but even his vanity could not blind him to the shift in the atmosphere. The power he thought he held, the power of the bailiff and the militia, had dissolved in the face of a single whisper. He spurred his horse toward the gate, the clatter of hooves receding into the fog, leaving behind a silence that was no longer heavy, but expectant. Adeline watched as Silas stood alone in the drive, his shoulders dropping just a fraction as the tension left him. She looked down at her own hands, at the ink stains on her fingers that marked her as a woman of ledgers and logic. Her mind, usually so scrupulous and certain, felt like a room where the furniture had been rearranged in the dark. Silas Thorne was her father's friend. He was the man who chopped her wood and helped her audit the debts of a dying house. Yet, the world around him seemed to bow in a way that defied all the arithmetic she knew. She realized then, with a cold shiver of certainty, that the man standing in her garden was not a guest in her world. She was merely a tenant in his. The house was no longer holding its breath. It was waiting for the true master to speak. The dawn over the Somerset hills broke with the heavy, bruised color of a plum. The humidity of the lowlands, pressing against the windows of Greenbriar Manor like a physical weight. On the distant ribbon of the London road, a speck of gold ignited against the morning mist. It was the glint that did not belong to the natural world of damp slate and weathered stone, a flash of polished lacquer and sunstruck brass that heralded the arrival of a power so vast it felt like a tectonic shift beneath the feet of the watching villagers. To Adeline Vane, standing at the high attic window where the glass was wavy with age, the sight was a terrifying intrusion. She watched the golden dot grow into the unmistakable silhouette of a royal carriage, its movement fluid and predatory. Down in the village of Vane Cross, the arrival was felt long before the sound of wheels reached the ears. A communal panic, peculiar to the English countryside when confronted with the divine right of kings, erupted into a frantic, fevered kinesis. Bessie Silla was the first to sound the alarm. her voice cutting through the damp air like a serrated blade as she abandoned her milk pails in the mud. Within minutes, the ritual of the desperate had begun. It was a sight of tragic absurdity. Men who had not shaved in days were suddenly scrubbing their doorsteps with a violence that suggested they were trying to scour away their very poverty. Women frantically straightened moth-eaten curtains and shushed their children with such intensity that the small village fell into a strained, artificial silence. Adeline descended the stairs, her ink-stained fingers tracing the cooling mahogany of the banister. She could feel the house itself bracing for the impact. The architecture of Greenbriar Manor seemed to shrink, its peeling wallpaper and drafty corridors suddenly exposed as the meager things they were in the face of such ostentation. As she reached the front lawn, she found the villagers lining the road, their spines curved in an instinctive, fearful obeisance. There was a distinct smell to this kind of communal terror. It was the scent of cheap beeswax, wet wool, and the metallic tang of anxiety. These people did not see a man in that carriage. They saw a natural disaster that could water their fields or burn their hearths with a single indifferent word. The golden carriage finally crested the rise, pulled by 6 white horses whose harness bells rang with a cold, crystalline clarity that felt like an indictment of the village's silence. The sound was not musical. It was the sound of iron and wealth. Beside Adeline, Bessie fell to her knees, her hands still clutching a damp rag used for scrubbing her stoop. The social distance between the mud of Somerset and the velvet interior of that gilded box was a chasm that no amount of industry could bridge. Adeline stood her ground, her spine as straight as the ledgers she had mastered, though her heart beat with the rhythm of a trapped bird. She looked for Silas Thorne, but her father's friend was nowhere to be seen, leaving her alone to face the approaching storm of royalty. 2 miles away, within the cramped but meticulously cleaned rooms of the village inn, a different sort of preparation reached its frantic zenith. Julian Halloway stood before a cheval glass that was far more honest than he would have preferred, his face a mask of sweating ambition. He was draped in a frock coat of midnight blue superfine wool, the velvet collar so stiff it forced his chin upward in a permanent sneer of entitlement. To him, the approaching carriage was not a herald of judgment. It was the arrival of his coronation. He believed, with the unwavering certainty of the truly vain, that the king was coming to ratify his greed and validate his claim over the Vane estate. He reached for the document resting on the vanity, his fingers lingering on the black wax seal with a lover's touch. This was his weapon, the physical manifestation of his triumph over Adeline and the scholar she sheltered. He practiced his bow in the mirror, a shallow, calculated tilt of the head that he intended to offer the king. It was the gesture of a gentleman who viewed the law as a ledger that could be balanced through the intimidation of the weak. Every time he lowered his gaze, he adjusted his cravat with trembling fingers, the scent of his expensive, cloying cologne filling the small room until the air felt thick and unbreathable. Yet, despite his outward confidence, a flicker of something unsettled moved in the depths of his eyes. Whenever the thought of Silas Thorne crossed his mind, he loathed the memory of Silas standing in the library, that pauper with pretensions who had looked at him. He took a final, sharp breath, the ebony stamp tucked firmly into his breast pocket like a talisman. He did not realize that the architecture of a soul is far more resilient than the architecture of stone, and that some debts are paid in a currency he could not possibly fathom. As he stepped out of the inn to intercept the golden carriage, Julian Halloway felt like a giant among the bowing peasants. He did not see the winter-colored sky, or the way the trees seemed to lean away from him. He only saw the glitter of the crown, unaware that the silence of the countryside had teeth, and that the manor house he sought to claim was finally, terrifyingly, holding its breath for the truth to be revealed. The dust raised by the royal outriders did not merely settle upon the drive of Greenbriar Manor. It seemed to coat the very atmosphere in a shimmering, expectant gold that tasted of grit and ancient protocol. The golden carriage, a monstrously beautiful construct of gilded wood and heavy leather, lurched to a halt with a final rhythmic creak that sounded like the groan of a dying era. In that moment, the house was holding its breath. Every stone, every timber, every neglected corner of the Vane estate seemed to brace itself against the sheer weight of the authority that had just arrived at its crumbling threshold. Julian Halloway stood at the base of the stone steps, his posture so rigid it appeared physically painful, his coat of finest charcoal wool stretched tight across his chest. He had spent the morning dousing himself in an expensive, cloying cologne that now hung around him like a heavy, suffocating mist, a scent that spoke of his desperation to belong to the world within that carriage. Rough her thin, faded pelisse, but she did not tremble. She kept her hands clasped before her, her ink-stained fingers hidden within her sleeves, though the memory of the Vane ledger, and the cold, hard numbers it contained, felt like a phantom weight against her ribs. She was the mistress of a house that was technically no longer hers, a woman standing on the precipice of a social execution, yet her spine remained a column of unyielding iron. Lord Julian, sensing the movement of the carriage door, suddenly shifted his weight. In a display of casual, practiced cruelty, he stepped directly into Adeline's path, his shoulder catching her with enough force to send her stumbling toward the muddy verge of the drive. He did not offer an apology. He did not even look back. To him, she was already a ghost, a remnant of a debt that was about to be settled with the finality of a guillotine. Julian reached into his breast pocket and withdrew the document bearing the black wax seal, the official eviction notice that would strip Adeline of her name and her hearth. He held it as if it were a scepter, his eyes bright with a predatory triumph. When the carriage door finally swung open, the silence that descended was not empty. It was a pressurized vacuum that made the ears ring. A footman in scarlet livery stepped down, his movements as precise as the ticking of a clock, and then the king emerged. George Augustus did not merely step onto the gravel. He took possession of the space, his presence a heavy velvet shroud that demanded the absolute submission of the landscape. He looked weary, his face etched with the burdens of a crown that had often felt like a cage of gold, but his eyes, sharp, observant, and constitutionally incapable of being deceived, scanned the gathered crowd with a terrifying intensity. Julian Halloway lunged forward, his face contorted into a mask of sycophantic joy that was as transparent as cheap glass. He began to speak, his voice a high, thin reed that cracked under the pressure of his own ambition. He spoke of loyalty, of the law, and of the scrupulous care with which he had managed the affairs of the district in the king's name. He thrust the dark insignia toward the monarch, the wax glistening like a dark, scabbed wound in the afternoon light. But the king did not stop. He did not reach for the paper. He did not even acknowledge the man who was practically vibrating with the need for a royal nod. George Augustus walked past Lord Julian as though the man were a piece of ill-placed furniture, a common footstool that had somehow wandered into the middle of the road. The snub was so absolute, so devastating in its quietude, that the air seemed to go out of Julian's lungs in a single, ragged gasp. Adeline, recovering her balance near the edge of the drive, watched in a state of suspended disbelief. She saw the document flutter in Julian's trembling hand, the black wax seal now looking like nothing more than a childish toy. The king's gaze did not linger on the house, nor on the weeping willows that lined the creek, nor on the small gathering of village officials who had come to witness the eviction. Instead, his head turned, with a slow, predatory grace, toward the side of the manor, where the overgrown rose garden began its descent into the woods. There, standing amidst the brambles and the long-dead stems of last year's blooms, was a man who seemed entirely out of place in a royal tableau. Silas Thorne stood with his feet planted firmly in the Somerset mud, his heavy, work-worn boots caked with the evidence of his morning's labor. He was still wearing his gardening apron, a thick canvas garment stained with the dark, rich life of the soil and the green streaks of crushed leaves. His shirt sleeves were rolled back to his elbows, revealing forearms that were corded with muscle and tanned by a sun that did not care for titles. In his right hand, he clutched a simple iron trowel, its blade encrusted with damp earth. He appeared to be a pauper, a simple academic who had lost his way in a library and ended up in a ditch, and yet he did not bow. He did not move to hide his stained hands or his disheveled hair. He stood as still as a monolith of ancient granite, his frost-hued eyes locked onto the king's with a steadiness that was almost an affront to the surrounding pomp. The visual contrast was a jagged, impossible tear in the fabric of social propriety. The king, a figure of lace, diamonds, and distilled sovereignty. stood facing a man who looked like he had just finished digging a hole for a new row of turnips. The royal guards shifted their weight, their hands tightening on the hilts of their sabres, sensing a breach in the expected rhythm of the day. They looked to the king for the order to remove this insolent gardener, this nobody who dared to hold a tool of labor in the presence of the crown. But the order did not come. The silence stretched until it felt as though the very bones of the earth were under tension. Silas Thorne did not. Adeline felt a sudden, sharp prick of realization in the center of her chest, a feeling like a needle finding a seam. She looked from the king's face, which had gone pale beneath his powdered wig, to the face of the man who had sat in her library for months, helping her balance the Vane ledger with the patience of a saint. She saw the way Silas tilted his head, a gesture of recognition that was so subtle it was almost invisible, yet it carried the weight of decades. The man she thought was just her father's friend, the man she had seen chopping wood and mending fences, was looking at the King of England not with fear, but with a weary, intellectual parity. The trowel in his hand did not look like a tool anymore. It looked like an indictment of every lie Julian Halloway had ever told. The atmosphere was no longer gold. It was cold, hard iron. And the house was no longer holding its breath. It was beginning to scream with the truth as the king stepped away from his retinue and toward the gardener. The silence that descended upon the gravel driveway of Greenbriar Manor was not merely an absence of sound. It was a physical weight, a suspension of the very laws that governed the Somerset countryside. It was as if the wind itself had been commanded to cease its play among the oaks, leaving the air heavy and stagnant. Julian Halloway stood with his chest thrust forward, his cloying lavender cologne, souring as the king ignored the eviction notice. He waited with the bated breath of a man who expects to witness a public execution. To him, the king's arrival was the final hammer blow against the impudence of a penniless woman and her vagabond protector. But the world did not follow the script Julian had written in his vanity. King George Augustus, a man whose very presence usually commanded the oxygen from a room, did not look at the document. He looked only at the man holding the trowel, his own royal composure fraying at the edges, trembling village spectators, his eyes heavy with the burdens of a regency and the shadows of a tiring reign, anchored themselves solely upon the man in the stained gardening apron. Silas Thorne stood amidst the dust of the driveway, a trowel still clutched in his calloused hand, yet his spine was a column of unyielding marble. He did not flinch, he did not lower his gaze. Then, the impossible occurred, the sort of event that rewrites history in the span of a single heartbeat. In a movement of absolute, terrifying silence, the King of England reached for the golden circlet upon his brow and removed it. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and carried the weight of 1,000 years of sovereignty. Before the gasps of the militia could even form, George Augustus lowered his head and sank to the ground. There was a visceral, grinding sound as the royal knees hit the dirt of the Vane driveway. The fine, cream-colored silk of His Majesty's breeches stained instantly with the damp Somerset clay, a mark of total and unequivocal submission. The King of England was bowing deeply, humblingly, to the man Adeline Vane had believed was merely a scholarly ghost from her father's past. Adeline felt the world tilt upon its axis. Her fingers, perpetually darkened by the inkstains of her labor, tightened around the mahogany-bound Vane ledger until the wood groaned in protest. She looked at Silas, the man who had chopped her wood, who had sat in her drafty library and helped her find the truth hidden in columns of debt, and realized she had been looking at a sun through a piece of smoked glass. The silence on the driveway now had teeth, gnawing at the foundations of everything she thought she knew about power and friendship. Julian Halloway's face had drained of all color, leaving him the gray, sickly hue of an individual who has realized he is standing on a trapdoor. Silas did not let the king remain in the dirt for long. With a movement that possessed the swift, economical grace of a man accustomed to the weight of a broadsword rather than a gardening tool, he reached out. He caught the king's elbows with a single hand, his strength effortless as he raised the sovereign back to his feet. As he did so, the afternoon sun caught the heavy band of metal upon Silas's finger. The iron seal, ancient and unadorned, flashed with a cold, masculine light that seemed to pierce through the pretenses of the afternoon. It was a ring that bore the crest of a house older than the current dynasty, a sigil of blood and stone that every royal guard present recognized with a visceral shock. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The militia captain, who moments ago had been prepared to shack Silas in irons, let out a choked sound of realization. As one, the entire royal guard dropped to their knees, the synchronized rattle of their sabers against the gravel, sounding like a peal of thunder in the unnatural quiet. They did not bow to the king. They bowed to the man with the iron seal. Silas stood at the center of this ring, of steel and silk, his winter-colored eyes fixed upon the king with a look of weary recognition. He no longer resembled a gardener. He looked like a storm that had finally decided to break its 7-year fast. The king's voice, when it finally emerged, was a ragged whisper that barely carried to Adeline's ears. It was the voice of a man seeing a ghost. He reached out a trembling hand to touch the rough wool of Silas's sleeve, as if to prove the man was made of flesh and bone. George Augustus shook his head, his eyes moist with a complicated grief. He whispered. Silas did not soften his expression, though a flicker of old sorrow passed over his winter-colored eyes. He glanced back toward the porch, where Adeline stood like a statue of white marble, her smudged hands the only evidence of her mortal struggle. He looked at the house, the living, breathing body of Greenbriar, that had been holding its breath for so long. Then, he looked back at his king. His voice was level, carrying the resonance of a cathedral bell. He replied that he had not been dead, only waiting. He had been waiting for the daughter of the only man who had ever known his soul to grow up, to see if she possessed the steel of her father. He had been the payment for a debt of loyalty that no crown could ever satisfy, and in the quiet of the Somerset winter, he had found a sanctuary more precious than any throne. Julian Halloway, standing nearby, began to tremble as the gravity of his miscalculation finally set in. Julian Halloway turned, his boots scuffing the ancient stone with a frantic, ungraceful sound that betrayed his carefully cultivated composure. The smell of his expensive, cloying cologne now seemed to rot in the cold afternoon air, as if mirroring his expiring status. He sought the periphery of the royal guard, a desperate animal, looking for a gap in the hedge. But the king's men remained as immobile as the marble statues in the long gallery. Every avenue of escape was barred by the very authority Julian had intended to wield as a weapon against the Vane family. George Augustus gestured with a subtle, gloved hand toward the man he had just honored, with a bow that had shattered the social order of the county. The king's voice was a low rumble of amusement, tempered with the cold edge of a sovereign's steel. He looked at Silas Thorne, or the Duke of Alastair, as the world now understood him, and inclined his head with a look of grim expectation, hifting to the trembling Halloway. And arithmetic, Julian, is a scrupulous master. It does not forgive a deficit of the soul. Silas did not move with the haste of a commoner or the aggression of a soldier. He simply reached for the mahogany-bound volume that Adeline Vane had carried like a shield for 7 grueling months. The Vane ledger was heavy, its edges worn smooth by her ink-stained fingers, and as Silas opened it, the dry, honest scent of parchment and old truths filled the space between them. To the village gossip, Bessie Miller, standing at the edge of the crowd with her mouth agape, it seemed as though the stranger, who had chopped her wood, was suddenly a god of justice, holding a book of life. He began to read. He did not read of his own ancestral titles or the vastness of his own northern estates that stretched toward the Scottish border. Instead, Silas Thorne read the names of the invisible and the exploited. Bessie Miller, he began, his voice carrying the resonant authority of a cathedral bell across the silent courtyard. A debt of £40, fabricated through the illicit alteration of a tithe receipt. Arthur Cole, a foreclosure executed 3 days before the legal grace period had expired, under the guise of an administrative error. Julian Halloway's face drained of color until it matched the gray, unforgiving slate of the manor roof. He opened his mouth to protest, to offer a clever legalism or a lie of convenience, but the quiet felt ravenous. Silas continued the litany, each entry a needle of cold logic that pierced the veil of Julian's respectability. He turned the pages with a deliberate, rhythmic precision, listing the families Julian had systematically dismantled through usury and the quiet, predatory manipulation of the king's own law. A ledger is the one honest room in the world. Silas said, his icy gaze fixing on Halloway with a weight that seemed to crush the smaller man's spirit. And in this room, you are found to be utterly insolvent, not in coin, though your debts to the crown for fraud shall be tallied to the last farthing, but in character. With the king's silent assent, the royal guard stepped forward. The man who had sought to own Greenbriar did not shout or struggle. He simply collapsed inward, a hollow man whose grandeur had finally been measured and found wanting. The sun dipped lower behind the jagged Somerset hills, casting long, bruised shadows across the great hall of Greenbriar Manor. The king had retired to the drawing room with his advisers to discuss the sovereign's affairs, leaving a silence in the main hall that felt heavy and expectant. The house was no longer holding its breath for fear of the bailiff's knock, yet it seemed to tremble under the weight of a different, more personal tension. The dust motes danced in the fading light, settling upon the faded tapestries like the debris of a fallen empire. Adeline Vane stood by the cold hearth, her spine as straight and uncompromising as a ledger line. Her fingers were still stained with the ink of the morning's desperate work, a sharp contrast to the velvet and silk that now occupied her home. She watched Silas Thorne enter the hall. He had discarded the gardening apron he had worn with such deceptive ease, and though he still wore the travel-worn coat of her father's friend, he carried the presence of a man who owned the very architecture of the room. "Adeline," he said, the name sounding foreign and heavy in the new, sharp clarity of his rank. He took a step toward her, his expression unreadable. A grief-shadowed sentinel whose demeanor had suddenly become a robe of state. She did not curtsy. She did not weep with the relief that a common woman might feel upon discovering a duke was her protector. Instead, she reached into the deep pocket of her plain wool dress and produced a handful of damp, dark earth she had scooped from the garden beds on her way inside. Before he could speak again, she let the dirt fall, a gritty, accusing rain that scattered across the polished floor between them. "You spent months chopping my wood and mending my fences," Adeline said, her voice vibrating with a simmering indignation that cut through the aristocratic stillness. "You sat at my table and ate my thin mutton soup while I counted every penny to keep a roof over the heads of my people. You watched me prepare for my own ruin. Silas, if that is even a name you recognize. You watched the color leave my face every time a creditor rang the bell." She stepped closer, refusing to be diminished by the revelation of his power or the proximity of his legendary status. "Did you find it an amusing diversion? To watch a woman struggle against a tide you could have stilled with a single signature. My father called you a friend, but a friend does not stand by and observe the slow death of a house while he holds the key to the well in his pocket." Silas looked down at the dirt on the floor, his jaw tight, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture of painful restraint. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant wind rattling the window panes. "I did not come to watch you burn, Adeline," he whispered, his grey eyes darkening with a complex, suppressed grief. "I came because your father asked me to ensure the estate was solvent, but I found that a house is not saved by coin alone. It is saved by the person who refuses to abandon it when the ledger is empty. I had to know if you were the master of this house or merely its victim." "Your blood may be royal," she countered, her marked hand trembling slightly as she gestured toward the empty space where the king had bowed. "But you are a liar, your grace, and a ledger does not balance when the numbers are written in the ink of deceit. You allowed me to believe I was alone in the dark." The torchlight shuddered against the damp slate of the cellar stairs, casting long skeletal shadows that seemed to reach for the hem of Adeline Vane's skirts. There was a peculiar weight to the air this deep beneath Greenbriar Manor, a scent of ancient earth, cold tallow, and a silence that felt as though it had been thickening for centuries. Silas Thorne walked ahead of her, his stride steady, his shoulders bearing the invisible mantle of the Duke of Alastair, with a grace he had hidden behind the rough wool of a gardener's coat for months. He did not look back, yet Adeline felt his presence as a physical heat in the freezing corridor. In the deepest reaches of the foundation, where the stone was older than the memory of Somerset itself, Silas paused before a door of iron-bound oak. He did not use a key. He simply pressed a specific sequence of stones in the surrounding masonry, and the door groaned open with the sound of a long-suppressed sigh. Inside, the room was small. a stone sepulchre illuminated by a single, high grating through which the moonlight bled in pale silver ribbons. He moved to the far wall and pulled back a heavy, moth-eaten shroud of velvet. Adeline felt the breath stall in her lungs. The portrait beneath was not a masterpiece of the current age, but its lines were unassailable. The man in the frame wore the stiff, fur-lined collar of a Tudor lord, a heavy gold chain resting against his chest, and a hand resting upon the hilt of a notch-scarred sword. But it was the face that froze her heart. It was the same square jaw, the same straight bridge of the nose, and above all, those cool, winter-grey eyes that had looked at her across the kitchen table every morning. The date inscribed in the lower corner was 1518. "Your father did not merely call me a friend," Silas said, his voice echoing with a low, melodic resonance that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. "He was the keeper of the truth. My house founded this estate when the first stones were laid, and it has been my duty, and my burden, to ensure that those who dwell within these walls possess the integrity to hold them. I have watched the Vane line for a very long time, Adeline." Adeline reached out, her ink-stained fingers trembling as she touched the cold, cracked oil of the canvas. The realization was a sudden, sharp arithmetic in her mind. He was not a distant relative or a hidden heir. He was the source itself, a man who had worn his grief like weather for longer than she could fathom. She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and saw the immense isolation of a soul that had outlived everything it had ever loved. "Thomas asked me to watch over you," Silas continued, stepping closer until the scent of ravine and cedarwood enveloped her, "but he also asked me to let the fire find you. If I had simply paid the debts, you would have remained a girl hidden in a library. I had to know if you would fight for the people of this land with the same rigor you applied to your ledgers. Being seen by the right person was not the danger, Adeline. It was the only safety worth the name. The quiet was no longer menacing. It had become a sanctuary." Adeline realized that her struggle had not been a cruelty but a coronation. He had waited for her to prove she was solvent in spirit before he revealed the gold in his hands. By the time the sun climbed over the Somerset Hills the following morning, the world had fundamentally shifted. The royal carriage had long since vanished into the mist, taking with it the golden perfume of the court and the sharp, cloying scent of Lord Julian Halloway's failed ambition. The village of Vane Cross was no longer a place of whispered fear and impending eviction. The king's bow had been a seal of sovereignty that no creditor would ever dare to challenge again. Adeline stood on the terrace, watching the light catch the morning frost on the neglected lawn. The house was no longer holding its breath. The stone seemed to soak up the warmth of the new day, and for the first time in 7 years the air did not taste of damp rot and desperation. In her hand she carried a simple cup of tea, the steam rising in a thin white plume. She found Silas in the garden. He was not wearing the velvet robes of a peer or the iron seal of his ancient office. He was back at the dry stone wall he had started months ago, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the calloused forearms of a man who understood the value of labor. He was lifting a heavy block of granite, fitting it into the gap with a scrupulous precision that required no words. Adeline did not address him as Your Grace. She did not curtsy. She simply sat on the finished section of the wall and set the tea down beside him. The Vane ledger lay on the stone between them, the mahogany-bound book that had once been a record of ruin. Now, its pages were white and waiting, a clean ledger for a future they would calculate together. "The wall is nearly finished," she observed, her voice steady and bright like a struck bell. Silas paused, his grey eyes softening as he looked at her. He took a slow breath, the tension that had gripped his frame for 7 years finally beginning to thaw. "A house is only as strong as its foundation," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur. "And a foundation is nothing without a heart to guard it." He reached out and placed his hand over hers on the open page of the ledger. It was a partnership of equals, an intellectual and emotional union that ignored the chasm of their ranks. The numbers in the book did not lie, but they were no longer the only truth in the world. The greatest wealth of Greenbriar was not the gold the king had restored, but the quiet, iron-hard loyalty of the man who chose to build walls rather than palaces. Adeline looked toward the horizon, where the lilacs were beginning to stir in the first breeze of spring. The debt was paid, the house was warm, and the silence was finally, mercifully, at peace. Tears are not forever, she thought, and as Silas smiled at her for the first time, a slow, genuine warmth that broke the winter of his soul, she knew that they had finally found the one honest room in the world. Have you ever felt truly seen by someone who owed you nothing? Perhaps true justice arrives not in a courtroom, but in the quiet recognition of one's own worth. Tell me where you are listening from tonight, and may your own house be a sanctuary. Good night from the fireside.